In this video, we're going to take a look at exponents and the Pythagorean theorem. It's used in structures with right triangles and a lot of other things as well. We know it as a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So we're going to take a look at how this is actually used in the world today, and how it might have been used, whether correctly or incorrectly, in structures of the past. We're looking at the Leaning Tower of Pisa in this video. And one thing we understand about this tower is that it does lean. We can calculate the amount of lean by using a right triangle. But let's just take a look at the history behind this tower. It took 199 years to build, and it was started in 1173. It began to sink in 1178. That's only 5 years after the construction had progressed to the second floor. So take a look at where the second floor is. That's when it started leaning. War caused the construction to stop for half a century. And so what happened during that half century is that the ground beneath the structure was able to compact and settle. It's actually what was responsible for the tower not falling down. And if it hadn't happened as they built the successive floors onto the tower itself, it would have crumbled. So war saved the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The underlying ground settled during that time, and it provided a little bit better foundation for it, but not totally perfect. As we can see, it leans to this day. In 1198, clocks were installed on the third floor, so now we're up to the third floor. In 1272, the construction resumed. To compensate for tilt, engineers built upper floors with one side taller than the other. So if you can imagine that, engineers would be fired for something like that today. Well, they'd be fired for creating a leaning structure, at least if they didn't do it on purpose. The seventh floor was completed in 1319, so now we're up to the seventh floor. And the bell tower, the very top tower, was finally added in 1372. And the bell tower is the only thing in the structure that's true to the ground. It's perpendicular to the ground. If you were to drop a line from it, if you could, it's a little bit smaller, but if you could drop a line to the ground, it would be perpendicular to the ground or true to the ground. There's been controversy about the legal identity of the architect of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. No one really wants to take credit for it, and again, it happened over several lifetimes, so it's difficult to really pin this on one particular architect. They didn't plan on it tilting like this, and so maybe it's a form of embarrassment, but today it is a landmark, and everyone goes and wants to see the Leaning Tower. Do you know who this guy is? Okay, if you think about it for a minute, think about around the 1930s and what was happening in Europe, and this man had something to do with this tower, as did many other people who looked at the Leaning Tower of Pisa as something that they didn't like. This guy was Mussolini, and he was basically the head of fascist Italy. He didn't like it tilting. He thought it was an inappropriate symbol for Italy, and so he drilled holes through the floor and poured 200 tons of concrete into the foundation. And what it did is it just compacted the foundation even more. It was built on an estuary, which is, silt and sand from riverbeds, and so it was very soft and very porous and very much full of water. In fact, water poured out of the holes that they drilled. So when they poured the concrete down in there, and by the way, what's a ton? How many pounds are in a ton? Think about that for a minute. But when they poured all of this concrete into the foundation, it leaned even farther south. So I can't imagine why they lost the war when they did this. It's really a banana shaped. Okay, the Leaning Tower is not a line that or a center of the building that tilts. It's really in the shape of a curve, and it's more in the shape of a banana. So it's a banana-shaped curve. And if we drew an arc that followed the curve of the tower, what we have to ask ourselves is, where would this take us? Where would it take us over on the other side of the world? Well, this is where I think it would maybe take us. It would take us to the Brooklyn Bridge. Brooklyn Bridge is full of right angles. And if we take a look at it, some of them are created by suspension cables, and not just hard structures like concrete and steel, but cables. And they're used by design to support the enormous weight of the bridge and to give it flexibility as well. The right angles are architectural and structural necessity in design, as we see in a lot of buildings and structures that we deal with today. And it's infamous for having been sold many times. And the guy who sold it, if you can think about it for a while, you might remember this name, George Parker. He lived from 1870 to 1936. If we subtract these two numbers, we would get to the point where we realize that he was about 66 years old. Didn't live very long, and he finally did end up in jail. He is considered to be one of the most audacious con men in American history, and no one knows what he really looked like. There are no pictures of him at all. So you might want to use your imagination if you think about the Brooklyn Bridge, and we're thinking about right angles and how historically these things all impact us. Think about, who he might look like, and just use your imaginations. I used mine. He might look like this guy, except maybe he would be smart. So here's the bridge, and if you think about George C. Parker, he probably took advantage of a lot of very innocent, unsuspecting immigrants to sell this bridge. Many, many, many times he did this, and was never really incarcerated or caught for that specifically. Wasn't until later. So he may have approached these people who didn't know that they could buy a bridge and asked them if they wanted to buy it. And of course they thought it was a good money-making opportunity. And once George got his money, of course he vanished and was gone. And these immigrants would sit up a spot on the bridge, and they would start charging people as they wanted to go across the bridge. And of course they would object, and they would call in the police, and the police would come, and they would arrest them and take them off to jail. And then once they heard the story, they understood that, these people had been duped and that they were quite innocent, and so they let them go. They were never able to apprehend him, George Parker, that is, until later. We don't know, what George Parker had in mind, but he certainly had the right angle when we talk about how he was so unscrupulous and how he managed to sell the bridge more than once. He may have had a different kind of an upbringing. He may have had a very unscrupulous father. He may not have had a very good life. He may have married to someone who wasn't a very good person, and that may have ended tragically. We don't know a lot about George C. Parker, but he was quite a salesman. So what is it used for? When we take a look at the Pythagorean theorem, okay, this is what it looks like. We have a squared plus b squared equals c squared. The square that you see here in the triangle, there down at the bottom, indicates that that angle is 90 degrees. Every right triangle will have a little box in that corner indicating that it is 90 degrees. The sides are labeled A, B, and C, and side C is what we call the hypotenuse. And again, Pythagoras was the person who is credited with actually coming up with this formula, so we have him to thank for it. Now, if we were to take a look at how we use right triangles, we would label the sides again, and the square indicates that it's a right triangle, and we would have numbers associated with those. So all right triangles have a 90-degree angle, all of them. And the other two angles then have to add up to 90 degrees because every triangle, whether it's a 90-degree triangle or a right triangle, has 180 degrees. So when we take a look at it, this is the hypotenuse. Where the name for that leg actually came up, I don't know. I don't know what the origins or the history are behind it, but it is kind of a silly sounding name. But it's a very difficult one not to remember when you think about it. It's called the hypotenuse. The other two sides are simply called legs or sides. So Pythagoras looked like this. Kind of looks like a biker, and I'm not sure exactly what he would look like if he were alive today, but maybe putting a different face on Pythagoras might help us to kind of humanize this thing. It's kind of hard to identify with this stone statue of what he might have looked like, whether it would have been accurate or not. Maybe he might look like this today if he were alive, and we might not call him Pythagoras. I'm sure we'd shorten that name up as well. So if we were to actually provide you with some numbers to calculate what the hypotenuse was equivalent to in number of units that we see here, if one of our legs, side A, is 6 units and side B is 8 units, we would plug them into our formula. So we know that side A is 6 units, and that would give us, if we put it into the formula, 6 squared. Side B is 8 units, and we would put it into the formula where we see B squared. So we'd have 6 squared plus 8 squared is C squared. And then simplifying, 6 squared. 6 times 6 is 36, 8 times 8 is 64, and we get 36 plus 64 is equal to C squared. When we add those numbers together, we get 100. So now we know that C squared is equivalent to 100. So we have to think about this for a moment. C squared, that means some number times itself should give us 100. And because we're familiar with perfect squares, it's very easy for us to understand how we would get there. But if it weren't an easy number, here's how we would go about doing it. We would take the square root of both sides. Remember, whatever we do to one side of an equation, we have to do to the other side. So we'd have to take the square root of C squared and the square root of 100. And when we take the square root of C squared, when we're doing it with a variable term, it simply ends up being that variable letter. And then of course the square root of 100 is 10. And then we would apply our units. We'd want to make sure that we attached our units to whatever our answer was. So the length of side C, or the hypotenuse, is 10 units long. So we should be able then to calculate any hypotenuse if we are given both of the legs of a triangle.